Good afternoon. My name is Dalia Habib-Linson. I'm the head of academic engagement at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and I'm delighted to welcome you, our guests, and our terrific panelists, Sochi Morales, Karthik Pandian, and Reto Thüring, to the first of three discussions, Artist, Student, Curator, Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Design Now. This new series explores how artists, designers, and communities of creative production have been impacted by and are responding to the multiple crises of now. From the current and intensifying global health pandemic and correlated economic uncertainty to heightened social and emotional tensions as a result of ongoing racial injustice in the United States and across the globe. These interconnected ruptures have not only forced dramatic shifts in the ways in which artists, students, and museum professionals work, but they've also revealed long entrenched fault lines in our social and institutional structures. In our conversation tonight, we're interested in understanding how these challenges have materialized in the lived experiences of our panelists and ponder possible future directions for artistic production and the role of cultural institutions. As a museum, we recognize the responsibility in creating a space for open dialogue, and we see tonight's discussion as an opportunity to listen and to engage with these issues through the perspectives of students, practicing artists, and curators. So before I offer some introductions of our panelists, I'd like to just share a little bit about the structure of the program. The format is meant to be a pretty open conversation, which will be followed by time for questions and discussion with the audience. You may have gathered by now that we're using a webinar format, which means that while you'll be able to see and hear the panelists, they will not be able to see or hear you. But although we can't see you, we very much welcome your participation in the form of questions and comments. So we invite you to submit them by using the Q&A button in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Questions and comments will be visible to us, the presenters, though not to the attendees. Finally, please note that today's session is being recorded, and we hope to have captioning available soon after today to coincide with the recording. And with that, I'm really delighted to introduce our panelists today. Sochi Morales is a cultural worker in the areas of mariachi, music education, film, spoken word, and performance. She is a current undergraduate in the history and literature at Harvard College in the class of 2022. Welcome, Sochi. Karthik Pandian teaches in the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies at Harvard University. As an artist who works in exhibitions and public interventions to unsettle the ground of history, he uses moving image, sculpture, and performance to render the mythologies of the present through forgotten, fragmentary, and futuristic pasts. Pandian has had solo exhibitions at the Whitney Museum of American Art and the Beton Salon, Paris, among others, and his work has been featured in numerous international survey exhibitions. His most recent project that we'll hear about today, Atlas Unlimited, a collaboration with choreographer Andrew Brown, sculptor Zakaria Al-Mutlaq, and many others, culminated last year in a presentation at 80 Washington Square East in New York City. Welcome, Karthik. And our third panelist is Reto Thüring. He's the Beale Family Chair in the Department of Contemporary Art. He joined the MFA in 2018. Prior to Thüring's arrival, he was the chair of Modern, Contemporary, Decorative, and Performing Arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where he oversaw the rapid growth of the collection of contemporary art. At the MFA Boston, he curated Reniki Dijkstra, Nan Gold, and Sheila Hicks in the fall of 2018, and most recently, he oversaw the reinstallation of the contemporary galleries in the Lindy Family Wing, and co-curated the exhibition Mural, Jackson Pollock, Caterina Grossa, as well as the first iteration of the annual banner project with artist Robert Pruitt. So welcome, Reto, as well. So we're really excited to have all three of you here and feel like this is a really wonderful opportunity to begin to think about some of the challenges that students and artists and certainly museum professionals are facing right now. So I'd love to begin with you, Sochi, to share with us a little bit about your work, what you've been up to, and a little bit more about how your work has been impacted in this moment and your life. Oh, and I think you're on mute, but here, let me see if I can mute.
Hi everyone, I'm Sochi. I'm a junior, a rising junior at Harvard, and I study history and literature, or ethnic studies. And I would mostly call myself a musician. My background is in mariachi music and producing music. And it wasn't until I got to college that I started experimenting with more performance-based art, performance and visual-based art. And since then I've been kind of developing practice. But it's an example of sculpture and performance work that my partner Carlos and I did at an event about abolition. I would say second to being a musician and an artist, I'm an organizer. I organize a lot in my community at home in California and as on Harvard's campus as well. Most recently, I've been mostly involved in labor organizing and prison divestment organizing, as well as ethnic studies organizing, because Harvard doesn't have an ethnic studies program and fires all of their ethnic studies scholars that are Black and brown professors. So my organizing efforts have been focused there for the past couple of months. And COVID and this kind of era of social distancing has been difficult, not only as a human being, but as an organizer that, finds community in groups of people and finds power in coming together in community. And as a musician, it's been very hard to have meaningful collaborations and but it has also been a kind of enlightening time for my own private practice and how I'm engaging my art with my community and with the current revolutionary moment that we see happening with Black Lives Matter and a lot of the Israeli annexation, Palestine organizing. So I think with the inherent ties between my community and my art practice, it has been kind of a turning point in how my art is being used and how my studies, I think, are going to be used in the future. I'm a very big believer in community-based art and art existing in the real world, and so it's been an interesting time, but it's been telling a lot of things.
Thank you very much. Karthik, can we ask you to go next?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me. And thanks to all that organized it, including Sophia, Walter. I appreciate all your efforts. So when I think about my practice, there's a lot of ways I think about it. I make exhibitions that are within institutional contexts, like the image you're seeing right now. But I also make public interventions that stay outside of institutions and might have a kind of para-institutional relationship to them. But at the heart of all this work, one of my central concerns is really both the transfer and the redistribution of energy and resources. And this is the kind of way I've been developing thinking about my work, not because it's some kind of like way of describing it, more is because it's like I'm always trying to grapple with what the heart of the practice is, like what is motivating it, what is the engine. And something around this relationship between energy and resources has felt really resonant of late. And another way to say that actually is something that I've been thinking lately, is that, you know, in a way, art itself is a kind of negotiation between transparency and opacity. And I endeavor to make the resources that I use in my work, whether it's rammed earth and glass and film like you see here, or whether it's actual labor capacity of collaborators, relationships, institutional issues. I endeavor to make those transparent, whereas there's often something opaque about the energy that flows between the world and the work and hopefully the audience in some kind of cycle. In some ways that's led me to thinking really deeply about video right now. You know, I think with any work of art, whether it's a painting or a sculpture, there's this stuff that you can see. And in my many years as a kind of museum educator and also as faculty at different institutions, I always try to like facilitate and extend that looking moment. Like, how do we articulate what happened here? How do we walk through the event of the work and really try to share even contradictory ways of coming to terms with that? Underlying and floating around and circulating through all that is something more opaque, something unknowable, unsayable, something felt, something that challenges knowledge. And, you know, video in particular, I think actually collapses a lot of those things. Like, again, as with any work of art, there's what happens when you're looking at it, but there's also what happens like when you have your eyes closed, when you're asleep, when you're dreaming, like when it's 50 years down the line, like when you're dead. I don't even know. It's like there's something that eclipses that moment of perception. And moving image and video has always held those two things really close for me. And in this particular moment, you know, I think it can't go without saying that video, you know, from the Rodney King beating in the LA that I grew up in my youth to George Floyd's murder by the police in Minneapolis, video has played a central role in both the kind of brutality and policing of Black life, and also the means through which it might be liberated. And it's that kind of dual role that has really made me feel compelled to both work with it really in a central way right now in a public art practice that I'm working on for the city of Boston in the next year that deals with questions of surveillance and visibility, and especially vertical video, which to me has art historical implications, like the history of portraiture, like questions of just like formal kind of intensities that can travel in that register, but also critically just like it is the format of this moment. It is the format of urgency, of like of having something to bear witness to a moment. And that's why I also feel compelled to like really centralize it in my teaching right now. And I'm getting ready to teach the first course in general education in video in the history of Harvard College, which I'll be doing in a year from now. And central to that is to have a large group of students really think about and work with video as a means of critically engaging it, but not through academic sort of like analysis, but actually through production, making images for social media and in those contexts and having them actually have a life in the world.
It's really wonderful. Thank you, Karthik. I'm thinking too about the sort of indexical nature of video, and in a moment like that, like the one that we're in right now, seems so appropriate to think about what it means to witness and what it means to literally leave a mark. So that's really great to be able to think about that in an academic sense as well. So thank you. So Reto, I'm wondering if we can turn to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And I want to start by thanking Sochi and Karthik for taking your time and be part of this conversation. It really means a lot to me that you're putting yourself out here and participate. I started as the chair of the Department of Contemporary Art about 2 years ago at the MFA. And I like to think of sort of my curatorial work and my work as a department chair as, even though they're very intrinsically linked as two separate things. As a department chair, I was from the start on, like, that was one of the reasons I wanted to come to the MFA, was that there was a very small department only in place with very few curators, some of which termed, and there was really an opportunity for me to build a department of contemporary art to a very sizable now department, and think about how such a department could look like and how it could be its best in terms of different perspectives that can come together about how each other's expertises can complement each other, how we can cover a lot of ground, because that is ultimately one thing that I think a department in a museum such as the MFA has to do, right? Contemporary art is an enormous, vast field that can't possibly really be overseen by even 20 curators probably wouldn't be enough. But at the same time, also thinking about how amongst ourselves we would have certain things that really connect us, that we agree upon, certain values that we think are sort of need to be at the core of what we do in terms of programming, and to negotiate that on a very ongoing level ever since more curators have joined the department. It's not without irony that that Marina T. Cuenco, she was the second curatorial assistant that started. Her first day was coincided with the first day the museum had to close. That was a Monday, and then a few weeks after that, she was furloughed, as were many junior staff at our museum and at museums across the US. And certainly something I've been thinking about a lot, how to certainly bring those people back and how to protect that junior staff, where a tremendous amount of the diversity that can be found in our field really sits, and without whom I believe none of us, no museum will be relevant anymore in a few years from now. In terms of curatorial, I've always been drawn to these big museums. I always wanted to be a contemporary curator, but I always wanted to think about contemporary art in this broader realm of art history, and world cultures, and how contemporary art within that context can speak to historical moments, to works from the past, and to how it can sort of like take on a vital role in negotiating current issues, but in a sort of context that sort of encompasses centuries, and that really spans the whole globe. So that to me has always been sort of like a vital interest. I do think it will always be like that. That to me is critical to my thinking as a curator, and I think it's been certainly also critical to us as a department, to think very specifically about the role that contemporary art can play in the context of a comprehensive, I really don't like the term encyclopedic, but in a comprehensive museum.
That's really great. Yeah, thank you. And I'm wondering if we can, I know Sochi, you had a couple of images, so I just want to go to the second one and ask if you wanted to make any comments about it and share with us a little bit about its significance.
Oh, I mean, it's just kind of like I have a background in playing mariachi music and teaching mariachi music to children in my community. This picture is actually from a film that I just helped write called Summertime, that was premiered at the Sundance Film Festival this year. And it was a very, very awesome project. It was experimenting in storytelling using spoken word instead of traditional film writing, all written by teenagers in LA, because it's a movie about LA. But yeah, no, I mean, it's okay. But yeah, that's the background of the picture.
Okay, great. Thank you. It does help us sort of see more dimensionality about your work that is so tied to sort of certainly music at its core, and also some aspects of film, which it sounds like you're getting more into. So that's really great. And Karthik, I don't know if you wanted to share with us a little bit about what's going on in this image, or if it helps us understand a little bit more about your work. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Could I get the screen share actually?
Sure. Let me go ahead and take it off here.
So I can begin a little bit while we get that going. So I said that before, I was kind of working quite a bit and thinking about video right now. I'm coming off of a multi-year project called Atlas Unlimited, which is principally a collaboration with my good friend, the choreographer Andros Zins-Brown, and also our good friend, Zakaria Al-Mutlaq, a Syrian sculptor from Homs, Palmyra, who currently lives in Brussels, Belgium. And I thought it might be useful to just walk you through a little bit of this work because it does really inform what I think of as my resources in this moment. That's something I've really thought about a lot right now. It's like, what are my resources? I learned something about how to answer that question, how to reach out to people, how to build up resources, even in a moment of distance from this project. So maybe I'll talk about it a little bit here. So Atlas Unlimited is a project in sculpture and performance that spanned continents, exhibitions, performances in a 2-year period, 2018 to 2019. It began, in some ways we can think about it as a story of 2 sculptures. One of those sculptures was this gigantic carnival float that Andros and I encountered in the small Belgian city of Aalst. And here you see a photograph from Act 1 of Atlas Unlimited, where we sort of, we created a carnival in a town that has a very carnival tradition, but we created an off-season carnival where we actually worked with De Loisemannen, who's a carnival crew, a really white working class sort of tradition that some of you might be familiar with in Belgium. And basically like worked with them and worked with what was really, in some ways pretty clearly like a racist sculpture. There was this sort of, there's an Orientalist theme to the whole thing. And all the De Loisemannen in the original carnival were sort of dressed in these like Turkish garb and doing this dance. And, rather than like just simply push away or say that this was an incredibly problematic form of representation, we sort of like gathered them into the narrative that we were building in this show, which largely centers around the life of Zakaria Al-Mutlaq, who's both our friend, a real person that lives in Belgium and is from Syria and is an artist, but also became a kind of semi-fictional character that he both played sometimes and other people played sometimes, and actually participated in this kind of carnival that you see here, where like the head of the camel was actually decapitated and brought into the exhibition. Other parts of that giant camel then went to Antwerp in this public art presentation where you could walk around with this headset and hear different stories and walk and see different parts of the camel throughout the port, which was a major port of emigration to the United States actually in the 19th century. Then parts of it went to Chicago in this exhibition at the Logan Center before coming to New York in the ADWSC show that Dahlia mentioned earlier. The other sculpture, and perhaps like the more important one at some level, and here you see Zakaria from Act 3 performing as himself, but also a speculative futuristic version of himself from the year 2028, who's been invited back to Palmyra by a kind of speculative Russian-backed Free Syrian regime. And he's been forced to make this monument to Syrian freedom that in front of a live audience that sort of knows that it's seeing a theatrical performance. He actually destroys the sculpture as the closing act of this exhibition. Fragments of that sculpture then travel to the different shows, like the show in Chicago at the Logan Center where we had builders, people like Jane Foley, who's an incredible conservator of objects, actually live working in the gallery, working to conserve the pieces of this sculpture that we never actually even told her what it looked like, and interacting with people and telling stories to people as they would come in. Then we went to New York, where our good friend Casey Lurie from Chicago designed a new sort of pedestal to sort of show the head of the sculpture. And then finally the body of the sculpture. During the show in New York, we actually pulverized, and we had a conservator from Florence, Daniela Corella, create a fresco out of the lime of the very body of the sculpture itself, while 2 singers were actually singing the sort of life of Zakaria, a libretto of stories from his life, in an adjacent room for the entirety of the exhibition. Zakaria couldn't be there because of the travel ban that was enacted after Trump's election. And that became a really important part of the show, is how to presence his absence, and questions of like fragmentation and breaking apart and coming together sort of ran through the whole thing. But at the same time, the whole project was a kind of experiment in creating para-institutional organizations. Because every one of these shows, you know, you're not really given a budget by an organization, right? Like there's actually very varying practices, and even in terms of how much transparency there is you're given to work with as an artist at an institution. But we sort of like more or less demanded to be fully aware of that whole process, and then to think about how we could redistribute those funds to our collaborators and create this sort of transnational community of builders that was working together throughout this whole kind of crazy 2-year project. And I've really, in the last 6 months, drawn on those people, this incredible group of people like Aliana de la Guardia and Ganavia Dorayaswamy here, and of course Zakaria, Andros, and many more, as a kind of like family of collaborators, but also proof that you can do this work remotely. Like I was often in the States, and Andros was in Belgium, and Zakaria was here, and they were there. And to think that we can actually do that kind of work of resource and energy transfer without necessarily being in the same room together.
Karthik, I wanna jump in and just ask you a quick question, which is, not sure if I'm supposed to, Dalia, but I hope you.
It's a
I've
conversation.
been thinking about the recent controversy around public monuments a lot, and I keep coming back to your work quite a bit in my thinking. And I was just wondering if, since you're dealing so much, you have been dealing for such a long time and so prominently with appropriation and reappropriation of cultural signifiers and how they travel through space and time, has your own view, has your view on your own work changed since, or have you sort of like, has there been sort of moments that certain things just resonated particularly with you since you've been engaged in this for so long?
I've basically felt pure, unadulterated joy. I felt pure joy and affirmation to see all of those statues come down. Affirmation on so many levels. One, just to like finish with this work, like this was the working ethic of, this work of Atlas Unlimited. At the same time, even the Unearthed piece before is that creation and destruction are intimately linked. They are not even separable necessarily. There's never one without the other. And so for us to pretend that things stand or fall, live or die, or to see them so diametrically opposite is actually like, that's the mythology. That's the mythology, to think that like a sculpture can stand there and that the history or whatever it represents is also standing. So I think they all need to come down. And I don't even, it's not even for me, it's not even for me about being judgmental or this or that one. I think that right now, the critical thing is letting the rebellion breathe and not sorting out necessarily good from bad acts. Because what we need to do, and this is just my conviction, what we need to do in this moment is we need to keep the energy going. And when I saw, for example, the indigenous people of Minneapolis take Christopher Columbus down and do ceremony on top of that fallen statue, I mean, that was one of the most beautiful, moving, inspiring, I don't like, nothing I could do in my work that is always like somehow framed as art. For me, like I can't, I'm so inspired by that. Not that I want to replicate that. It's just like that to me is that's the kind of like definitive action that both works within the field of art and without. It just erases all the binaries and barriers that all the kind of chatter ends up perpetuating.
It's really interesting. I wonder, Sochi, if you have thoughts on this notion of a sort of representational system that cultural objects like statues represent. When you think about your work, what sort of thoughts do you have around that.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've also kind of been in a space of centering or using a cultural symbol to kind of make transparent something that is represented by the cultural symbol. In the performance that I sent a picture of that's in the slideshow, that was from a performance of a group that my colleague and Carlos and I called Grupo Grosero, and it was centering cumbia, which is not a physical kind of cultural symbol or signifier, but when you're talking about Latinidad and talking about the Latinx identity, cumbia is something almost universal among an ethnic, like a racial or ethnic group that we haven't figured out what exactly it is, a race or ethnicity, but it's something like that kind of unites something that's so fragmented and complicated by colonization and indigeneity and race. And so my colleague and I used cumbia to, and also this sculpture, which is a replication of like a taco cart that you would see in LA, which is where we both grew up and our community is. And we wrote a manifesto on these cards that are hanging from the taco cart that read and advocated for the abolition of prisons and all the crimes against humanity. We read all of them out loud as they were orders, as if they were orders from a taco truck, to kind of center, we wanted to center something of celebration of something that was familiar to our community in order to kind of talk about, have a conversation about something that would be so considered very radical in our communities. So we had this performance, read the manifesto out loud while cumbia and a soundtrack of our community was kind of playing in the background. Yeah, and at the end we kind of deconstructed the cumbia and slowed it down until it was finished, and we kind of just were laying on the floor. We could deconstructed actual tacos, but kind of just laying something in front of an audience and then deconstructing it. And then afterwards, the entire event was a conversation on prison abolition, police abolition. So it was kind of way for Carlos and I to enter our community, bring our communities into the conversation. But and thinking about the destruction of these monuments and thinking about symbols of racism and colonialism and these histories that have oppressed our communities for so long. I'm wondering, I struggle a lot with this as I'm a student at Harvard, but I'm wondering how, especially in this conversation as well, how we are including the institutions in which we represent in these conversations. I think that's a really important framework for this conversation as we're representing the MFA and the art world and these institutions of art, which have heavy stakes in these histories of racism and colonialism and the erasure of Blackness and indigeneity. So yeah, I guess that's an open-ended answer, but kind of being, I would really like to have a conversation about where we are centering the MFA, how are we talking about Harvard? How are we talking about these symbols of racism that, I mean, that the MFA can probably be considered as one, right? So yeah, I'm just wondering what you guys think. And I would really like to engage the audience as well, if there are any comments or concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important and necessary question that that we need to discuss, certainly at an individual level, at a professional level, and institutional. And I would love to get some feedback from our attendees as well in the form of comments or questions, because I think this is precisely where that tension between the notion of individual practice, professional work, and institutional boundaries exist. And I think that the conversations over the last few weeks have really demonstrated a clear understanding of the need to put action ahead in front of, and sort of embody the words that a lot of our cultural institutions are speaking. I think that there are, structural issues that have been revealed over the last few months that are very much in need of being addressed. I think that, I can speak to my own role as an educator in the museum. I think this is something that increasingly my colleagues and I look to centering in terms of how we talk about the works in the collection, how we talk about the history and the structures of museums that have been largely built on certain kinds of practices that center white histories and highly Eurocentric histories at that. So I think that with a critical eye, I think we're beginning to re-examine many facets of museum work, from exhibitions to programs and certainly to educational offerings as well. So I don't know, Reto, if you want to pick it up from there.
Yeah, I would very much like to. I think first I want to maybe kind of connect two things that Karthik and you, Sochi, just said, which is, Karthik, you talked about energy, and I think maybe the greatest, I tend to refuse to sort of talk about this moment as an opportunity, just because I see a lot of careers like in disarray, a lot of people losing their jobs, and it's hard to sort of frame this without being cynical as an opportunity. But I do think that the energy that at the moment is so tangible, and I really hope it's going to be a sustained energy or pressure, if you will, on all institutions, because I think without sustaining that energy or pressure, we're actually not going to come out of this truly changed. But I do think if people in the streets, people taking real action, are going to be able to sustain that pressure, I think institutions such as the MFA and every other museum will have to change. They don't have it. There's no other option at this point, and I think that's the true, real opportunity that we're looking at. I think of there's always like a two-way. Like in my role, I always think of like there's like it's two-dimensional. One is sort of what you project outward, sort of the public-facing part of what you do. It's like exhibitions, programming, and that's actually the easier part. You can change more quickly. I would argue that we have, like, the MFA has been very slow even in changing that and sort of like create true equity within our exhibition program, within our acquisition, what we acquire and so forth. But I have seen change at the MFA and at many other institutions there. And the other part is sort of this inward facing thing, how you actually incorporate those same values. And I argue that ultimately you can't, on a long-term basis, actually do this outward-facing change if you don't tackle first and foremost the structural part. And that's mainly staff. And the other part is sort of a cultural question, how you can create a culture within your institution that also makes sort of a more diverse staff feel really welcome and heard. And in that regards, museums have been incredibly slow. I mean, to a degree that it's really concerning. And I do hope that will change. I really hope so. I do believe that there's a willingness to do so. And as I said at the beginning, I think with that sustained pressure, I hope that ultimately, like, no institution will have a choice, and will have to. That would be.
Here's the thing. I would say that there's a third way, and this is going to be a bit roundabout, but I think that we need to turn institutions inside out. It's not just the outward facing and the inward, but it's like turning them inside out. And here it's like, when Sochi rightly brings us to think about, questions of racism and even incidents in the recent past, like we have to think about, there's plenty at Harvard, but in particular in my mind right now, I'm thinking about what happened with the charter school from Dorchester in 2019 in the MFA galleries, the racial harassment that a student group experienced there. That I'll speak with like many hats on right now, because I spent over 10 years of my like first professional experience working as a museum educator. And we know, like to some of Reto's points, like these are some of the first people to lose work once in this kind of pandemic situation, right? Like all the sort of non-contract freelance folks. And there's so many people out there hurting right now, a lot of whom are BIPOC, people of color, like just the people that are on the ground doing a lot of the work that are actually like on a micro level dealing with these issues every day. And I can say that for a fact, having worked at MoMA, LACMA, Museum of Contemporary Art LA, Guggenheim, even Studio Museum in Harlem, like, except for the Studio Museum, let's say, I'm gonna put an asterisk on that. The part of my job that was never spelled out to me, was never put on paper, and I was never compensated for sure, was I was there to protect both the children I was working with in the galleries from the policing efforts of the institution, and also to protect the institution from the potential threat that these students represented. And this was not something that we barely ever talked about, but you could feel it in a palpable way. The sense of like not belonging, the sense of not belonging that they bring in with them, the sense of like fear, the sense of being followed, the sense of being watched, all of that, I felt like you constantly have to shield them from that by giving all these verbal and physical and cues to say like, no, this is okay. And then you're also doing the opposite. You're also trying to make these people feel at home in a place that frankly does not have a politics or a praxis of care or love for them. That this is like really the issue. And there's a kind of policing that exists in all institutions of our society, Harvard, MFA, but then you can go through everywhere that is essentially white space. There's a policing that you feel, and people feel to various and extremely, extremely asymmetrical degrees, right? Like what Black Americans, what trans Black people, what Indigenous people feel. I know I can feel, I'm very sensitive to a shade of it, but I will always like say that it's adjacent for me. There's been times when it hasn't been, but I'll say that like a lot of us out there are doing this work, that we're always doing this work. And we're doing it in the classroom, we're doing it in department meetings, we're doing it like all over the place. And getting back to this idea of the inside out, it's like, for me, I feel like there's another way. What has pandemic been for me? It's been a time of retreat. I have the privilege, I have the income, I have the safety, I have the home to afford that 100%. But I've retreated. I mean, I'm also like, TMI, full disclosure, I'm like just post-op knee surgery. So I've been like laying here on the couch in retreat, like convalescing too. So, but this period is like one of physical, spiritual, aesthetic rehabilitation. That doesn't mean that it's been alone, and that doesn't mean that I haven't like been networking with all these sort of like people that feed me and nourish me and support me. So what does that mean for institutions? Like for me, it means that this might be, why not? Why couldn't this be a time for, rather than saying it's like we're shut down and we're inactive and we're gonna do things that are sort of like an echo of what we might have done, we'll figure out this, like, I feel like there are opportunities, even in the budget crunch, to go out and work in public and to also claim the reality that institutions are completely embedded and responsible to the public. That it's not just what happens when people come in, but it's everything from like the architectural authority to the colonial history of plunder, like to the white wall that so many people just feel so starkly thrown against, Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So what does that mean? Like, to me, that means maybe like this is the time to rethink everything. If we're in like potentially in this phase of rebellion and uprising, working towards what some of us hope is a moment of true possible upending of real structures of exploitation, racism, and the kind of like systemic looting of life and property. Like, what can institutions like Harvard and MFA that are themselves symbols of property, right? Like, why do those security guards need to be there? They need to be there because of the value of the property at some level, at some fundamental level. And yet, isn't this the time to think about that? To think about what, in line with the work that the incredible abolitionists are doing out there, people that I feel like I'm learning from, an incredible lineage of especially women of color, Black women that have been thinking about not abolition is just destroying something. This is a very different thing than what we were talking about before, but the idea of retreating resources from one space to reinvest them in another. And there are opportunities that I feel like are out there right now. Like, for example, like even, I'm in a public art program that's working like in relation to the city of Boston, not officially with it. And, there are all kinds of artists out there that are trying to use their work as a means to do what I would say is like good work out there right now. A lot of them have budgets. A lot of them have like ideas. A lot of them have projects. What a lot of us don't have are like any administrative resources, like ways to like think about getting permitting, things of making stuff happen that actually don't necessarily even take money. And I just feel like there is this opportunity right now that maybe like, what if all these institutions that were shut down essentially leverage their resources to support work that was happening in the public, and even maybe didn't foreground the sort of like curatorial value that was there, but rather like was just really thinking about how before we are ready to invite people back in, what do we need to prove out there? And maybe in the quietest way possible, just by like showing our support in some way like this.
I think it's an interesting consideration in light of your earlier question, what are the resources that I have, right? And I think it's interesting for us to think about that through the lens of our individual practice work, but also in terms of institutions. What are the resources now that we might be thinking of that might be able to be used in a different way, perhaps?
I just want to respond to Karthik's the points that Karthik just brought up, because first of all, I just want to say amen to everything you just said. Like personally for me, I never stepped into an art museum until I was late in high school. And I was an artist since I was little. And I think the points that Karthik just brought up just reiterate that these institutions are symbols of looting from communities, of racism against communities. And this is a moment where we need to think, where we should totally completely turn it inside out. We should be giving the entire institution to the community. We should be giving all of the resources to the community and repatriating all of the art that has been plundered and looted from our ancestors and from the people that came before us. And if not, then these institutions are not going to come with us into this decolonized future. If they still uphold and symbolize racist systems, homophobic systems, transphobic systems, then they will not progress with the revolution. And I think I recently read an article which was published in Teen Vogue by Decolonize This Place. Teen Vogue is actually a very radical news source, but it's about how maybe these institutions don't have a place in our decolonized future unless we completely reimagine them now and centralize them in communities. I mean, if we're removing these statues and these, like, if we're deconstructing the ivory tower, then we should be doing the same at the MFA. We should be doing the same at MoMA. We should be doing the same at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But now I think, now I think how this time period has shifted the role of art. If we're thinking of completely ending systemic racism and making sure that everyone has a place in the community, a valuable place in the community, then we need to be serving the revolution. We need to be serving the communities that are doing the work. And we can't do that until the community exists inside of the institution and not just as kind of on the periphery. And I think this is a question I struggle with a lot as a student at Harvard, a first-gen low-income student at Harvard. And I learn more and more about Harvard's investments in the prison industrial complex, immigration detention centers, in climate justice, and their lack of investment in climate justice and these justice issues that we're talking about now, which can also be reflected in their refusal to have an ethnic studies program. How can someone that believes in the revolution exist in that space? And I think the only way you can do it is by taking from it and existing as a resistance to it within it. If I cannot exist at Harvard ethically if I'm not taking its resources, redistributing them to my community, and organizing against the injustices that I see there every day. And I think the same needs to be done by all these people inside the institutions that we're talking about now. And as Harvard administrators, as curators at the MFA, that revolutionary mindset has to be in every single individual that is there. And yeah, that can be done by hiring more staff, but it also, like you said, Reto, it also has to do with the culture. And right now, the culture is not community-centered at all. It's not, or not enough. I've seen some initiatives, but I mean, as long as we're still plundering, looting from communities, there's no place for these institutions in the future as they exist now. So this has to be a moment of radical action and not just kind of band-aids over a gaping wound.
I want to respond by saying two or maybe three things. Like, one is I fully embrace the radicality of like what you both just said, and I do believe, like I said that before, that's actually and truly necessary in this moment. And also, and that's contradictory to a degree, like I do believe in the MFA and in the purpose of an institution such as the MFA and museums in general. That's why I entered that field, and I continue to believe in them as institutions. But I do think, and I sort of take that from both of what you said, like I think the notion of how we welcome people and the notion of like how anyone can enter such a space, and I would say by entering, that would start at the MFA even before you go through that door, because first you pass the Dallin sculpture and a lawn, and you kind of look at the neoclassical imposing facade, and then you have to push open some very heavy doors, and then you enter a next space that is as intimidating, if not more, with marble sculptures made by white men. So I think as long as we're not succeeding in radically shifting that notion of welcoming and of and belonging, we're not going to, I think there I completely agree, we're not going to succeed as institutions to remain relevant into the future for, you know, the larger public that we really try to serve. 100%.
I would just add that, if I may, sorry, Dalia, that I feel like we've been talking about some really big things, and that's really good. I'm really happy that we're going there. I think there is something I feel it's slightly more like elementary in this moment, that's a way to like take a lot of just to like check how we're doing. And that to me right now is, if you're not feeling discomfort, you're not doing the work, right? Like that our goal cannot even be to have actions that dissipate the discomfort. The goal is not to pretend that, and this is where I'm coming from on this. It's not to pretend that everyone can be elevated to the level of privilege of whiteness, and then we can all somehow occupy a neutral, empty center from which no one has to think about their embodiment and negotiate that on like a daily level. That to me is a fantasy. The reality is that it's gonna hurt, is that, you know, there has to be some elevation and strengthening of people that have been crushed and really, really, really brutally crushed for centuries. But there really has to be not only just an embrace, but a seeking out of the discomfort from those that don't know how to feel it. You have to learn how to feel that discomfort. You have to take your share of it actively and love it, you know, because I think that the word that keeps coming back to me in this time, which is like, you know, you talked, Reto, before about opportunity, like that is a bit of an icky word, but like, I do feel that there is like enormous amount of love in this time. You know, love is like, you know, when I talking about, for example, like when that Columbus statue was felled in Minneapolis, like that to me was an act of destruction as love. That was so generous on behalf of those people. Like, these are people that are leading us, leading a society that does not want to be led. And that is an act of love. To obliterate the ego in that way is just a kind of pure form of generosity. And the pain teaches you that. Like, the pain teaches you that. And it's like, it's more just this thing where it can't be this thing of like institutions, like, you know, in their beneficence, like doling out the funds and like giving access. It has to, the energy, the language, the spirit of that movement has to shift fundamentally, because it has to be one to say, as a white person, I am at a deficit for not understanding the kind of grinding pain that can open up into a love that can change the fucking world. You know, like that's what we're seeing, you know, that's what we're seeing right now in the streets. And it's still happening, no matter they're covering it or not.
I think we should probably like leave some room and time for questions, but I do want to say, Karthik, I would measure any institution and any leader at this moment to a large degree on their readiness and their willingness to go into this arena of discomfort and to stay in there and to face that emotion over a sustained period of time without even trying to sort of get out again of that zone into sort of like a comfort zone, but to actually embrace that and transform it somehow into positive energy and change. I think that's sort of the challenge of this moment, in a good framed in a positive way, if successful.
I'm sorry. I'll point out that we're a couple minutes shy of 6, and so if anyone does need to leave, that's fine, but we'll just keep going, because I'd like to be able to get to one of the questions in our queue here. So this is open to anyone on the panel. Thank you all for your thoughtful contributions to this essential conversation in your respective opinions. And this ties in to what Reto was just talking about with regard to leadership. Can the stewards of culture who have engendered, abetted, and continue to benefit from the present state of affairs, i.e. a cultural program of de facto white supremacy, be quote unquote retrained, or must they be replaced?
I'll jump in there quickly, because I think this actually relates a lot to where I started with that sculpture and Atlas Unlimited. You know, for me, I'll say a couple things about this. In that moment, it felt essential to fold even the most problematic element that sort of entered the field of the work into the ecosystem of the work, you know? And it was not about teaching them something, right? Like my collaborator Andros, who created a new choreography for this parade, right? Like I'll say that one of the most incredibly powerful things that I think we did in the project was not sit down and have a discussion amongst the refugee community, Syrian refugee community in Aalst, and the white working class community in Aalst around this racist float. You know, I don't think any of us were under any illusion that a kind of like the liberal ideology of entering a room as if that's some neutral space and like opening a door and opening a conversation could get at how deep the kind of elements of racism, xenophobia, fear, sense of unwelcoming, right? Like that so many refugees feel everywhere. Like that wasn't the thing. What Andros especially did in our collaboration so beautifully was like, he made a dance. You know, the dance was silly as hell too. It was like this really funky, weird dance that they all had to learn together, you know, like, and that's something I feel like. I don't know about when Achilles says retraining. I don't know if I would use that word. I think that we need new rituals. You know, we need rituals of being together and being adjacent to one another, and not always like this, or not always like the expectation is that you say something, I say, but like we need to do stuff together that is not necessarily the thing that needs to be done, but the relation, the adjacency, the energy that's built between people that have radically different viewpoints, radically different places they're coming from. That to me was the most productive thing that happened in Atlas. So the answer in some ways is like, I don't think it's just about replacing people. I think we need to rethink the rituals of how we even like think about hiring, like not just hiring, but like, it's not just about slotting new people into the system that already exists. Like the way meetings are conducted, the way all this stuff, like this stuff, there's so many people out there working right now on ways to do this work with love and positivity, to not trigger shame in people, to not have them hide further in their senses of fear, which only sharpens the impulse to lash out and create more violence. But we need to lean on lean on like reparative justice. We need to lean on techniques that have been developed for this type of work.
Sochi, would you like to respond, or Reto? I have a quote that I'm going to be pulling up in a second to respond.
I'll respond. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that has been kind of in the public eye since the beginning of the kind of current energy that's circulating around destroying systemic racism. And, you know, I haven't done as much reflection on this as I think I should have. But I do want to go back to something that I think Karthik brought up a while back about the practice of abolition in everyday life. I think, I also probably wouldn't use the word retrained, but I think there needs to be a fundamental change in how we relate to each other and to this the larger institutions that we are part of. I think there needs to be it needs to be an environment that holds people accountable and to the practice of love and care and humanity towards everybody. And I think that practice is abolition, and that's the way that a lot of people are practicing that sort of environment right now. And that's the practice of love and investment in your community and investment in the communities of others. So that's where I stand right now. I'm definitely going to be reflecting on this question for a while though.
I would just say that art and artists are good at, can be good at this, right? Like there's that level of sensitivity, and this is not to paint a broad brush at all, but I would say that there is something about just like creating forms that allow people to open up, you know, and that creates opportunities to do this type of work. And it's like, you know, it may not be a surprise, but I really do think that artists need to be leading this work. You know, like artists their voices need to be amplified. They need to be involved at much more primary levels of conversation around this. Like, just to like go practically back to that question, Reto, about monuments, like if and when like there is a revolutionary committee on the question of monuments, like it needs to be comprised of artists, activists, historians, and curators. It can't be some secret cabal in the corner of the commission of the city or the museum or whatever. You know, it needs to be people that understand what it is to like push intensity into material. And it needs to be people that know that feeling of pushing it in and getting it out, like, because that's what people are trying to crack open in these sculptures, you know, like there is this intensity and brutality in those sculptures. And what people, I think, are doing at some level is they're trying to break that open and let it out, you know.
I couldn't agree more about the need to open up these conversations around monuments and public sculptures to include other voices than, you know, the ones we assume are sort of the experts. That would include myself. That we actually bring in people from our community and enter a conversation which is open to different paths forward and to different results. And to the question before us, I don't want to evade it. I think I already sort of answered it. I continue to deeply believe in museums. I really do, meaning that I do think museums can change, but I also do think that over the past few months, certainly for myself, I think for many of my colleagues, like the realization that how deep this change needs to go has just become so much more obvious, right? That it can't just, I mean, I never thought of this as like a cosmetic kind of surgery. But I for myself too have come to understand that even the depth of change I thought is necessary isn't even going to cut it. That needs to go much further and much deeper, and that we truly need to kind of, you know, change the very foundations or some of the pillars that we stand on.
And maybe shift those foundations altogether, I think, to really, in some ways, start that project anew, is to question the values upon which the museum is built. So, and to that point, there's another question that's come up, which is, doesn't the idea of welcoming suggest that you have to be invited in instead of assuming that you belong?
I think there's two things. I think we all need to continue to invite. We need to think very hard about how that invitation looks like. And the second part is, which I mean with belonging, like when you actually come to the museum, how do we present ourselves? And what do you perceive as a visitor? And how do you relate to what you see? Or how can you relate to what you see? Do we tell stories that are part of your world, part of your stories that you know, that you're familiar with, or are these all like the very same stories that have been told over and over again? And that's the belonging part, where I think we can, but I don't think these are like, I think they're both necessary, and they both actually play crucial roles in how we move forward. Maybe I misunderstood the question, but
I would agree with you. I think that there's a certain degree of, frankly, emotional safety that people have to have in spaces like museums. And I think about it again from the perspective of an educator, to really be able to engage in what art can provide as a means of learning. I think that you have to feel sort of safe in that space at a very fundamental level, before being able to engage in narrative or disciplinary connections. I feel like there has to be a certain sense of comfort within that space. And that comes, I think, in that notion of welcoming. So I think a lot about these questions in my role, certainly when I'm working with college audiences in the museum, but I also think about it, in my own experience, working with other colleagues in the museum, and we think broadly about how do we decenter those very dominant narratives in the work that we do with student groups? How do we explore narratives that haven't been told? How do we explore concepts across collections that unearth ways in which humans have struggled and celebrated and mourned and loved across time? Through how do objects help us do that? And how do we sort of let go of those very dominant ideas about certain histories?
Yeah, and I feel like I wanna make clear maybe where I stand on some of this too, because I feel I have a very complicated relationship to the museum, in the sense that like Sochi, I didn't grow up going to museums. And Reto, I know you shared some of the same background with us, that it wasn't like a part of our like family's practice in any way. I started going at the very end of high school. But personally, I've had a lot of like incredible experiences there. I mean, like from working, like I basically started in an educational zone, like with a multicultural internship at MoCA in LA. Like, these types of programs are really important to actually like demystifying some of these spaces. So I want to say that. I also want to say that like I'm not like everything needs to be transmuted, reshaped, transferred, redistributed, reorganized. I don't advocate in terms of like an institution. For me, policing in museums needs to be abolished. I don't advocate for abolishing museums. And I'll try to say why. Because I think that like in a kind of potential revolutionary situation, this is where sort of like, the Bastille becoming the hay barn, like the adaptation that happens, like the reusing of spaces, that might have been sacred in profane ways, like the bringing in of all those things that we think, contaminate or make that kind of like inhibit a museum from doing what it needs to do. I feel like I am inspired by seeking out, trying to like work collectively with, people that are ancestors of mine, that are artists I've never met, people I know and love, like people that I've worked with in a curatorial way. Like I know that there are a lot of people out there that feel these kind of fierce feelings, like in different ways. And I think that there is a possibility of like harnessing and really pushing against some of what feels like dogma in some of the museums. And I like that pressure. I mean, I don't know if this is like a political statement, but I like it. It's motivating. It's something that I can really, really work against and work around and try to like, just try to sort of like recast where it's flowing. And I feel like, at least I just want to say that that's sort of where my head is at in terms of that. It's like, how deep can we, as you said, Reto, as you said, Sochi, it's like, how deep can we get into re-scripting, recoding even, some of these spaces.
Yeah, I would also like to reiterate kind of my position on the issue too, because I was posing questions about whether or not the museum would exist in a decolonized future. And and like institutions like Harvard too, I think that by existing in adjacent places or even within institutions that we're talking about now, there's an inherent belief in for me, it's in the people and in at the MFA, it's also in the art and in the space. Like I want to have museums in a decolonized future, but I don't want them the way they exist now, the way that the institutions exist now. I think there needs to be a full reimagination of the function of a museum, and also in the way that it interacts with its staff, its artists, its the communities in which it exists, and in whose art it houses. I think there needs to be, I agree, I definitely believe in the kind of community that Karthik just described, but I don't think that's what exists now. And maybe that exists for like some people, like rich white people, but for low-income, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, that's not what it is right now. And I think in order for it to exist that way, like Dahlia said, there needs to be a full shift in the foundations of what the museum is, the things that it's rooted in, the things that it continues to represent. But in the future, I think museums should be a communal space for gathering and collaboration and resource sharing. And I think that's the only way it can ethically exist as an institution in the future, and the decolonized imaginary.
Well, we're at about 6:15. So I don't know if we don't have any other questions from the audience, but is there anything else that anyone wants to share, or ways we want to continue the conversation? Well, I want to thank you three very, very much for this conversation, and for being here, and for engaging, and for raising a lot of points that have been circulating in a lot of different ways and bringing a lot of clarity to it, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, Reto. Thank you, Sochi. I just did want to say one last thing. I wanted to also just thank everyone else whose labor went into this production, both known and unknown. And I also just want to give one last shout out to a Boston-based organization that I feel like is really doing the work right now. FTP is a Black youth activist organization. I was happy to have gone to one of their marches from Roxbury to City Hall. It was the most energizing experience of this movement that I've had so far. So they have a very lively Instagram presence, so you can find FTP Boston on there. And I would say support what they're doing if you feel like you're down with it, because I was just so inspired by these youth that are leading this moment. So I want to just shout that out too.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Karthik and Sochi. This is, you know, essential to be in this space together, and to listen and learn and move ahead, and to center voices such as yours. So I truly appreciate your openness and your candidness and your critique.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Dahlia and Sophia and like Karthik said, everyone whose labor went into this. Yeah, I'm looking forward to what will come of conversations like this, not just at the MFA, but in institutions at large.
All right. Good night. Thank you so much.